Let's have a look at how we can render a form. But first, we'll look at our project. So we have our main controller sitting in the controllers package. Then we have the index.jsp, which is in this folder structure right here. The application properties will tell our project where to look for this index.jsp. And then we have the pom.xml that has this Tomcat dependency. So make sure to add that before you move on. In our main controller, we need to start with an annotation. So we'll say @controller, and Control-Shift and O will import that for us. We then add another annotation. We'll say @request mapping, and this will deal with our route. So we're going to use the default localhost 8080 route. And here we need to return our index.jsp. So we'll say public string index. We don't need to pass anything in, but we do need to return index.jsp. So Control-Shift and O will import that request mapping, and we actually have enough to display a page now. So let's run our project. We'll go to right-click, run as Spring Boot app. If I bring the browser over here, refresh, we can see that we have a blank page, but we have a title up here. So insert title here comes from this line right here. And we can see that the body is empty. We can now start populating our page. We can use an h3 tag just to say login at the top. And then we'll add our form. So our form is going to ask the user to enter their email and password and then submit it. So for that, first we need to add an action. And this action actually deals with the routing. So we're going to send all of our form data to the login route, and our controller is going to deal with that. We'll also add in a method here. And for the method, we'll say get. So this is already done by default, but I'm adding it here because we'll come back to it later. So in our form, we'll start with the label. And the label will say email. And then we'll get an input. And this input will have the type and the name of the input. So the type deals with the type of input that we're using. And then the name is an identifier that our main controller is going to use. So we're going to say type equals text, and then name equals, and we'll just say email here. So I'll save this, rerun the page, refresh the page, and we can see that we have our login, we have the email label, and we can enter any text that we want. So now we'll do the same thing for password. So we'll say label, password, and then for the input, we're going to use a different type here. So we'll say type equals password. I'll let you think about that for a second to predict what's going to happen, and then we'll give it a name, and we'll call this password. They just happen to be the same thing. They don't have to be. It's just coincidence here. So saving this, running the page, and refreshing it will give us the email and the password fields. In our email field, if we say Bob, we can see the text. But in our password field, if we type something in, we don't actually see the characters. And that is what we get by using the type password. So now we need to add a button to our form. So we'll say input type equals submit. And then we don't need a name, but we need a value. So we'll say value equals, and we'll say log in. So this value is really the text that's on the button. So if I save it, run it, and refresh it, we can actually test this out now. We'll use real data this time. So we'll say bob@gmail.com. And then for the password, we'll say hello. And if I click on login, and notice the value says login, and that's what the button is. If I click on it, we get a problem. The problem is we don't really know what to do with this login route. We never did anything in our controller, so we don't handle it, and our project is confused. The reason why I clicked on that button to submit the form is to show you what happens with this get method. So if we look at this address bar up here, we can see that we have all the information that the user has entered displayed to us. It is not something that we want, so we'll deal with this later. And now let's go back to our main controller, and we should probably add the login route so that we can do something once we submit the form. So we'll say at request mapping, and here we'll say login, then public string login, and we'll return welcome.jsp. Welcome.jsp doesn't exist right now, so we should probably add that. Let's go to our folder here, go to new, other, JSP file. Next, we need to call it welcome. And here we are. Now we have the welcome page, and I will change the title just so we can see that it's a different page. And then on our main controller, now when we go to the login route, you can see that here we're simply just showing the user the welcome.jsp page. We're not actually doing anything with the data that's been submitted through our form. So we need to deal with that first. And to do it, we're going to use something called request param. So at request param, we'll pass in a value, and this value is going to be that identifier that we had earlier. So we'll say email. Remember, in our index.jsp, we have these names. So we have the name email here and name password. We'll use that to link our data back to our main controller. So here we have our email. We'll save it as a string, and we'll call it email. We'll do the same thing for password. So at request param value equals password. And it will be a string and password. I'll also import these, Shift, Control, and O. And now we have access to the email and password that the user has entered, but we're still not doing anything with it. So just for practice, we're going to save the email in session and then display it to the user on the welcome page. So I'll add HTTP session here. Call it session. I will import that, and then session.set attribute. We'll use email and email. So now we should have access to this email on our welcome page. Of course, before we can display anything on the welcome page, we need to make sure that we add Jstl tags to our project. So here we need to add another dependency, and this is the Jstl dependency. I'll save this, and then on our welcome page, I need to make sure that we're using them. So here you need to add this line, and once we have that, we can go and say something like, we'll add a p tag here. So we'll say p, and in our p tag, we'll say hi, c, out, value equals, and then for the value, we will use our email. So that should take care of that. So what we'll say now is hi, and then whatever the email is that the user has entered will be shown on our welcome page. So I'll rerun this. And we need to make sure we go back to our home page. We pass in bob@gmail.com. We'll say 12345 for the password. Log in, and there is our email. So we have hi bob@gmail.com. It's exactly what we wanted right here. It says welcome at the top, and now we only have two issues. So the first one is that GET request that we talked about. So we have all of this data up here. We don't want that to happen. So let's say Bob came to my house, he used my computer, he logged into this page, logged out, left, everything's fine. And then later, as I'm going through my browser history, I can see that all of Bob's information is right there. I can see his username, I can see his password. So that is something that we don't want to display to just anybody. To get around that, we would have to use a post request, and we'll look at that in the next lesson. The second issue that we have is that we should never render a page when we process a form. So once the form is processed, we should ideally redirect the user to a new page so that the data that's coming from the form is not submitted again. Because if we take the form data and we render a page, that form data is still there. So refreshing the page would resubmit the form data, and we could potentially charge somebody over and over. If this was a payment site, there could be other errors. So it is not something we want to do. We'll take care of that in a future lesson.